welcome, really, to all and everyone coming in through the Gishmei Bracha. Okay, so even though Beshalach, almost everybody focuses on Kriyas Yamsuf, we're going to focus on the Mon, okay, which, again, some concepts that we've heard the story so often was like, yeah, Bnei Yisrael went into the Midbar, there's no food in the Midbar, Hashem gave them Mon. But why give them that particular type of food? Why in that form? Why in that way? And we know that it has a lesson for all generations because of the following pasuk.
Did Sfas come before the Mon?
What came before?
Mon. Didn't the Sfas come before the...
Yeah, but the Mon was the daily. That's what we're looking at.
Why the necessity for the Sfas?
Yeah, the Slav is a separate parsha there and in Balos. Okay, so in Perek Tes Zayin, Pasuk Lamed Beis, it says, Hashem tells Moshe to set aside a container of Mon. Shui, wow. Wet shui. There's hot water in the kitchen if you want. Okay. Vayomim Moshe. Moshe said, Ze adavar asher tziva Hashem. This is what Hashem commanded. Meloi ha'omer mimenu lemishmeres l'derasechem. You should fill an omer's worth of Mon in a container to be kept for generations. Lama'an yir'u es halechem asher achalti eschem bamidbar. So that in future generations you will see the bread that I fed you in the desert. Botzi eschem me'eretz Mitzrayim. When I took you out of Mitzrayim, and then Moshe tells Aaron to set this away. Okay, now the question is, what's the message? What are they supposed to see? Part of the whole trickiness of Mon was that it didn't look like anything else that existed. In fact, that's the name. Monhu means like Mahu. What is this stuff? So Sfas Emes explains like this. Lama'an yir'u es halechem. That they will see this food, this bread that Hashem gave them. But the Mon, there really wasn't that much to see. Okay, it was this white substance. So he says that's exactly it. Now the Gemara says, he quotes from Yuma, Sumin ochlin ve'ein sevein. People who are unable to see, eat, but don't get satisfied. Okay, now he's going to explain this as something that has much more spiritual significance. But even in the physical, there is a concept that the sight of food, the presentation of food, is part of the experience. It's one of the reasons why we have Shabbos candles. Right? One of the reasons for Shabbos candles is because you're supposed to have Oneg Shabbos and you prepare the food, and if you would eat the food without seeing it, something is missing. Abaye in the Gemara says that if you have a good food, a particularly good food to eat it in a time or a place where you have light, because otherwise it's almost like wasting it. Something will be missing. It's a famous study they did with food where they took tasteless food coloring and they colored different foods strange colors with no change in the taste. People would eat less of it. You have some bright pink spaghetti or something, or glow-in-the-dark green. Remember green ketchup? There was at one point they produced green ketchup. Okay, and it was off-putting to people even though the taste wasn't there. So the sight, and in fact, people say when you make the bracha on a food, you're supposed to take into account also if it's pleasing to the eye. Now, he says, that's one way of understanding in the physical sense why there's something lacking. But there's different types of blindness. There's blindness also where a person doesn't see the inner dimension of something, where a person doesn't see the spirituality of something. So he says, "Be'emes ikar alechem va'amazon u'chiyus ha'pnimiyus sheyesh bo." Let's look at what a piece of bread is. What you have on your plate, what is that? It comes into the world, it's life force which is sent by Hashem. How do I know it's life force? Because it gives me life when I ingest it. And that's how it originally starts out. Chiyus pnimius, what's called. Internal life force that HaKadosh Baruch Hu sends into this world. And then it, so to speak, constricts and takes physical form in something that I can physically ingest in my body. But that isn't, the main point of it isn't the carbohydrates, etc. The main point, what's inside of it, is this life force. As Chazal said, they said, "Oh, Yoni, kol hakavod." Okay. There's hot water in the kitchen if you want. Ein lechem el Torah. Okay, Bereshis Rabbah. See, Yoni about Bereshis Rabbah, right? It says, lechem, bread is Torah. How is bread Torah? Meaning, the inside of bread, so to speak, and this is trying to correct our assumption. Bread is bread. Saying, no, bread is created with something. Its inner self is b'koach haTorah. Everything was created b'koach haTorah. V'chiyus hakol me'osios haTorah. Everything really is given its existence from the letters of the Torah. For example, let's say somebody is looking at a screen of a computer game on their computer. So they'll see there's, I don't know, a little bear and a dog, and I don't know what's going on in that game. But a person who understands the computers well can say, really, that's all lines of code. If he's a real genius, he can look at the graphics on the screen and he can tell you the lines of code that make up what's on the screen. So in the same way, it's true. I have a sandwich here, but that sandwich is really made up of lines of code, so to speak, of the Torah. They say, the Baal HaTanya said at the end of his life, that he stopped seeing the actual objects, but he would see the letters of Lashon HaKodesh that made them up. Meaning, he would look at a tree and he saw Ayin Tzadi. Right? He was seeing beyond that. So when he would look at a piece of bread, he would see the permutations of letters of Lashon HaKodesh that give it its power, that its battery. Exactly like... Huh? Yeah, correct. Another thing, a person... If someone could look at us, they could read off, so to speak, the DNA sequence that's behind it. Excellent. Now he says, therefore, hasvia toli bistaklus ha'adam. Satisfaction, right? Svia, we say v'achalta v'savata uberachta. Satisfaction is something that depends on how a person looks at it. Okay? Even though Chazal, we'll talk about it in a second, Chazal had to give a shear, had to give a measure for Svia when we decide what's the threshold for benching the Oraisa. The Pasuk says, V'achalta v'savata uberachta. You will eat, you will be satisfied, and then you say Birkas HaMazon. Okay, but how do you determine satisfaction? So they came up with the shear of Kibetza. Right? You'll say, some people have bigger appetites, less appetites. That's okay. Chazal create their baseline, which is there. But nonetheless, the idea of satisfaction from something really depends on how you look at it. For example, it says the lechem aponim, right? The Kohanim, at the end of the week, would be able to divide up among themselves from the lechem aponim, the special showbread, what they called in the Mishkan, and it was divided up in very small pieces. And the Gemara talks about a Kohen who said, I got a piece the size of a bean, and it satisfied me entirely. Okay, now say, wait a second. I mean, a bean-sized piece of bread, if you want to tell me it's magic, okay, so it's magic. But how could that be even real? So let's take a look at the concept of sentimental value, right? Certainly, Hasidim, if you go to a tish, right, and the Rebbe's giving out, right, these little pieces of things, and people get a little piece, they're so happy, and they're so delighted with that little piece of fish or whatever that they got.
I just look at the periodic table.
And what do you see in the periodic table?
You have lighter elements and you have a heavier element.
Oh, right. So there's different periodic
table.
you're right. Okay, so if a person is given something by someone very precious to them, very close to them, right? Let's say that classic example in the fairy tale books. You know, the person who's in love with the princess, and she says, I will give you the greatest gift of all. I will give you a lock of my hair. Okay, you go to the barber shop, there's plenty of locks of hair on the floor, nobody's running for it, right? Why is this, he's so delighted with this? Again, it's not the quantity of it, but it's how you're viewing it and where it comes from. So he says, the Pasuk in Mishlei tells us, Tzadik ochel l'sova nafsho. A tzaddik eats to the satisfaction of his soul. Okay? Meaning, first of all, this is laying out for us that eating is not meant to be simply a physical experience. It's not just meant to be something that physicalizes you. Eating is an experience in which Hashem's feeding you. And He's giving you life, both physically and spiritually. That's a very intimate and intense and powerful experience which is happening. So the tzaddik is ochel lesova nafsho. When he approaches a meal, he realizes this is going to be a spiritual experience. This is going to be something that fills me with ruchnius. How? Al yedei shireu mamin ki achiyus me'atorah me'akadosh baruch hu. Says because this physical thing, it has its existence from the Torah and from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And I connect with it, and it becomes part of me. And therefore, he says, that's what satisfies him. It's also a pasuk in Mishlei, he says, which says, Pekach einecha sva lechem. Open your eyes and be satisfied from bread. Meaning, if you look at it in the right way, so then it's this incredibly satisfying experience. Now you have to realize that what's happening here is this can happen with different quantities and even with different qualities of food. Sometimes people think that if a person is holier, so the food is not an enjoyable experience. It's not true. First of all, you couldn't make a bracha on a food that isn't enjoyable. The brachas we make on food are called birchos hanehenin, the brachas of pleasure. If I give you a super mega max ultra vitamin pill that gives you all the nutrition you need for a month and you swallow it down, you don't make a bracha on it unless it tastes good, right? Because it's not on the nutrition. It's on that pleasure which is there. So you say, so what? Everybody has to step down from their spiritual levels and simply dive into physical pleasure every time they eat? No. Eating is something which can be and is supposed to be a very uplifting spiritual experience. Look at how we frame it. We have brachos before, we have brachos after. It's supposed to be done, it's something which is treated with respect. We have halachas and Masorah that teach us how to respect food, right? Aside from not wasting food, but in not putting it in disrespectful places like on the floor, right? Not using like a piece of bread to clean up the table or something. This is because it is something holy and something which is happening. Now he says, when it says, Sumin ochlin ve'enon sveim, the blind person here is the person who's viewing the food as only physical, is not realizing that this is a spiritual experience that's happening. And this is something that's bringing life not just to his body, but bringing life to his soul. And he's going to get from the ruchnius, from the spiritual life force that's in the food, it's going to become part of him. But a person who's blind in that way, he doesn't experience that at all. He eats, but he's not satisfied. What do you mean not satisfied? He just ate an entire pot of cholent. How could he not be satisfied? You're right, he's full, right? And physically, he's satisfied. But there's something missing in him. There's something, an opportunity there of something he could have connected to, but he didn't. And that is the idea of not being satisfied. He says this person who has this partial blindness, he only sees physical food, and he only had a physical experience. But if a person could see, he says, with the eye of the seichel, and then he says, you'll have a very spiritually satisfying experience. So this, he says, can explain why Mon in certain ways was called a deprivation or a test. In Maseches Yuma, right, it says, L'ma'an anoscha. Hashem gave us the mon to, the word anoscha is interesting. It can be either from a lashon of inui, suffering, deprivation, or as what's like, it's related to ani, who is poor. L'ma'an anoscha, because you're getting food that doesn't look like anything. They said, you're getting, kids love this medrash, that the mun could taste like anything. Right? That's one of the favorite things. Your mother tells you, eat your broccoli mun, and you think, I'm going to eat ice cream mun, and she won't even know. Right? You can have whatever you want. Now, so why would anybody complain about the mun, as we saw Bnei Israel did? Oh, you're right, you got to use your mind. Or, why is it that, right, why is the mun described then as a test? It's the greatest treat in the world. Low calorie, every taste you want in the world. I'll just tell you an interesting answer from the Kotzker Rebbe. The Gutsky Rebbe said, yeah, mun could taste like any real food in the world, but it couldn't taste like your fantasies and imaginings of what a food tastes like. I don't know if you've ever had that you sometimes had a memory of something that tasted really good, and then you go and you have it again. It wasn't really like this thing you imagined. It was, I remember there was once, I was on a trip to America, and I just stopped into a gas station, and there was some candy there that I'd remembered from when I was a kid that I really liked. And I looked, and it had no U on it, and I tasted it. This is horrible. I imagined it as the best thing that was there. Okay, so he said that's the same thing. Mun could leave a person unsatisfied because people aren't real. People always want something to match their fantasies, and that's very difficult.
Maybe it also could be another Indian of Histaklis with regards to what Rashi says by their getting upset over the mun, where there was no waste produced from the mun.
Correct.
So another aspect of like the way they're looking at the man is effect is this is not a natural food, and that further affects the ability they would have to be satisfied with it.
Correct. It's abnormal, and it made them forced them into an abnormal life, so to speak. Correct. So he says the idea here is the following. He says it didn't have to deprive them per se, and it wasn't there to make them suffer. But the fact that physically there wasn't much to focus on in Mon enabled you to focus on the spiritual more easily. He says, the way he phrases it so beautifully, he says, as you open your inner eye, so the outer eye closes, right? Meaning here there was nothing for the outer eye to focus on, so the inner eye would be that which could appreciate the Mon. However, right, not everybody can do that. So therefore, like he says, when in the future, when Am Yisrael complained about the Mon, that's because once you weren't on that level that you were able to appreciate that full spiritual experience of eating. So yeah, the Mon was pretty boring, right? Bilti al hamon einenu, they said, we've got nothing to look forward except Mon. What's for lunch? Mon. What's for supper? Mon. Right? Always the same thing. Okay, now the Sfas Emes takes us to a fascinating thing in the way we eat. It says, Be'emes hamazon yesh bo chelik ruchni v'gashmi. Okay, everything in the world is both physical and spiritual. This is so key to everything we do in Avodas Hashem, because much of our Avodas Hashem involves physical actions, physical items, and without the understanding that those items have a spiritual reality and affect a spiritual reality, it just seems silly. Watching somebody shaking a lulav and esrog. Why are you shaking those vegetables? Right? How much did those cost? Oh, you don't want to know, right? Why can't you just use a lemon? No, not a lemon. It's got to be a citron. Why? They're both yellow, right? And there's all these things. Why are you looking at the top of your loaf? Well, I want to see if it's cracked at the top or something. Otherwise, because all these things, the physical things, are reflecting a spiritual reality. Okay? They're both physical and spiritual at the same time. They affect the physical and spiritual at the same time. So that's the bottom line of everything that we do. And certainly food is both physical and spiritual. And we, who are physical and spiritual, consume it and unite with it. So he says, ha'ochel b'li das, a person who eats with no thought whatsoever. He's basically kind of, me hungry, that food, eat. That lowest level eating. So he's not thinking about any spirituality. Nonetheless, he says, his neshama gets nutrition and his guf gets nutrition. I'll tell you a strange Hasidic story just to illustrate this. The story about a gentleman in Poland who he worked hard all his life, and then when he retired, he decided he wanted to be a tzaddik. So he thought, okay, how do I be a tzaddik? I guess I have to sit in shul all day and try and learn and daven. He still didn't feel like a tzaddik. He said, I know what I'm missing. Tzaddikim fast a lot. So he started to fast every Monday and Thursday. He still wasn't feeling the buzz. He started to fast every day with just a little bread and water at night, and he would only eat normally on Shabbos. And then some strange things started happening. One day he asked his wife, he said, you know anything about Christianity? She said, no. He says, I don't either, but that's like pretty ignorant because we live in a Christian country. We're surrounded by Christians. We've been living here all our lives. We don't know anything about it. She's like, Moshe, what's wrong with you? And again, on Shabbos, he kind of flipped back to himself. Next week, he asked her, he said, I never met the bishop of the city. That's really rude, right? He's the big bishop. They say, I never met him. The third week, he already said he wanted to convert to Christianity, so they schlepped him off to the Chozeh of Lublin. So the Chozeh said to him, he said, tell me, sir, do you believe that eating non-kosher food damages your spirituality? Right? That's why we don't eat it. It's not because it's dirty or yucky or anything like that. It's because it would damage our spiritual engine. He says, yes, I do believe that. He said, then you should also believe that kosher food nourishes our spiritual engine. He said, you've been fasting and you've been starving your neshama. And that's why your neshama is going crazy. You have to eat properly and normally. So the guy starts saying, but tzaddikim, he said, but tzaddikim, there are certain tzaddikim who fast entirely l'shem shamayim, and that alone provides them with nutrition. You're fasting because you want to feel like a tzaddik. That's not l'shem shamayim. You have to eat well and to heal your neshama by eating good kosher food that nourishes you spiritually, not just physically. Okay, but the Sfas Emes points out, okay, but if you're not even thinking about the spirituality, your neshama gets food. Everybody has a guf and a neshama, and that very basic person who just wants to stuff food in his mouth is also feeding his neshama. He said, that's true, but the difference is that the guf is getting the main nutrition, what he calls bekeva. That's what's really happening there in a set way. V'nefesh b'mikre. The nefesh, because the nefesh is attached, is wired into the guf, so the life force also drips into the nefesh. The two are connected. So even though you're eating and focusing on the physical, and you're absorbing all of that physicality, but it's that life force which is there, the spirituality which is there, and the person's nefesh continues on also. Okay, but the opposite, the tzaddik who's ochel esova nafsho, so he's eating, and that experience is empowering his nefesh. The guf, meanwhile, is wired into the nefesh, and the guf is drawing its life force from the nefesh. That's an entirely different experience. Okay, so he says that was what was supposed to happen with achilas hamon. The mon was designed to help people focus on that as something which fed the spirit, and the guf, the body, would also get supported with that as well. He said that's why they had to leave Mitzrayim before you could eat mon. Because they needed that level of freedom. He said the real level of freedom they achieved from Mitzrayim was an idea of slavery to physicality, to chomer ulevenim, to mud and bricks. The idea afterwards was that the neshama didn't have to be enslaved to the body, but the neshama can be primary, and then the body can receive from it. Okay, so this is what's fascinating in terms of all types of life force and nutrition in our lives. For example, the Ohev Yisrael of Apta said the following. We all at some point come up with this question, right? Let's say a person goes out to make his way in the world, to earn his career, and he davens to Hashem for parnasa, and he learns the halachas of being a businessman according to halacha, and he treats his customers and co-workers and everybody as he should. And Baruch Hashem, he makes lots of parnasa. You have another guy who doesn't daven a word. He rips off his customers, treats his employees badly, and he also makes money. So Hashem's giving parnasa to everybody. Right? You say, very nice, look, Baruch Hashem, this guy davens, he learns, he tries to do everything right, and Hashem sends him parnasa. I say, okay, but this guy doesn't. Hashem sends him parnasa too. What's the difference? So Ohev Yisrael of Apta answered it with a mushal. He said, let's imagine two guys who got married. And they got some wedding presents. And now, guy number one looks at his wedding presents, looks ahead at life, and he says, very expensive to be a frum Jew. I got to find a way to earn money. I want to be able to bring up a family and to help my community and to do everything a good, fine Jew should do. So Hashem says, puts in his head an idea, you should take that money you got for your wedding, you should buy a horse and a wagon, and you'll buy some hay to feed the horse, and you'll take packages and people, and you'll drive that, and you'll make parnasa. And so he does. There's another guy who just got married, and he is not thinking about building a good Jewish life and helping his community or anything. All he knows is that he has some money and he wants more. Now Hashem doesn't just look at people in the world. Hashem supports what he said, Mikani me'emi mad beit sekinim, from the tiniest creatures to the biggest creatures. So Hashem looks in his world and he sees there's a hungry horse that needs feeding. So he puts in this man's head, you should buy that horse, and you should buy a wagon and some hay and feed the horse and take people around. So the Ohev Yisrael said, do you see the difference? In one case, the man is feeding the horse. In the other case, the horse is feeding the man. Okay, so that's the two ways it is. And the same thing can be between that body neshama reaction which is there. Now, he then goes on, he says, okay, Am Yisrael were supposed to look at the mun. Am Yisrael was supposed to see the mun. We no longer have that, right? Probably it was hidden where all the things of the Mishkan were hidden, which again, as far as say, it's no place, right? Any archaeologist can find it. It says, Nignaz bimkomo, it was hidden in its place, means it's like those things are in another dimension until the times come for them to be revealed. He says, the Sfas Emes, we do have something in our generation which still has an aspect of the mon. What is that? That's Sudas Shabbos. Sudas Shabbos, which we say is this Me'ein Olam Haba, right? The Me'ein Olam Haba doesn't mean that in Olam Haba you eat lots of cholent and sleep a lot and these things. Me'ein Olam Haba is that on Shabbos the spirituality is primary. Okay, Rashi in Maseches Beitza gives a fascinating definition of what's called the Neshama Yisera, this extra neshama that you get on Shabbos. He says it's the ability to eat more and drink more without your nefesh being right, put off by it. Because during the week, a lot of times the nefesh gets pushed aside a lot. You're hungry, you just got a shawarma, right? The nefesh saying, don't forget about me. Is like, quiet, we're eating shawarma. You know, he's not there. But on Shabbos, the idea is, and that's why Shabbos is where we do our most physical things, because the neshama is in extra strength, not just full strength, but extra strength. And therefore, it's primary. And it's able to utilize and enjoy the physical aspects of the world exactly the way that they were meant to be enjoyed. Okay? He says, the Meichel Atzmo has cherus. The food of Shabbos has freedom. Right? It says that the Me'ein Olam Haba, it says in the Gran Brachos, is the Nachala of Yaakov, the inheritance of Yaakov. Chalticha Nachlas Yaakov Avicha, which Yeshayahu says is Nachala B'li Mitzarim. The idea of no limitations, freedom. So the idea is that no matter what the food of Shabbos is, you're able to connect to it and to connect to the ruchnius of it and to get that nutrition. Right? Everybody knows the famous story about the king that ended up tasting the cholent on Shabbos, and it was the greatest food he ever had. So he sent, to get the recipe from wherever Jew it was that he tasted it from, and the cook cooks it up exactly according to the recipe. The king says it's no good, right? The person explains to him, he says it's a Shabbos food. That's what the secret is of the taste of all these things. Okay, now here we have a strange contradiction. On one hand, according to halacha, you're supposed to make the Shabbos food nice. Okay, you're supposed to make it tasty. The Maharal of Prague said an interesting thing. He said the eating on Shabbos comes from a different motivation than during the week. During the week, we're eating to replenish energy. And it's true, that's both physical and spiritual energy. He says on Shabbos, what we're doing is we're tasting from the pleasures of the world that Hashem created. And that's why it's a holy thing to go shopping for food for Shabbos, to make the food for Shabbos, to eat the food for Shabbos, for sure. Nonetheless, the experience of Shabbos food doesn't depend on the quality or quantity of the food. The food on Shabbos is a gateway into the spirituality of Shabbos, and it could be anything. So 2 stories about this. One, I saw different versions of it. The first version I'd seen was about the Baal Shem Tov. The Baal Shem Tov walked out of the davening with his Talmidim, and he says, I want to give you a gift, but the condition to receive this gift is that you won't laugh. They said, okay. So he walks with them to a little hut on the edge of town, and he says, look in the window. So they look in the window, and they see a very poor little hut there. And there's a man and a woman, and they have a tiny table, and there's a little napkin on the table with something under there. And they sing Zmiris, they sing Shalom Aleichem with great enthusiasm. And there's no wine to make Kiddush on. So what you do in such a case, you make kiddush on the bread with these two tiny rolls. And he made kiddush, and he said hamotzi, and they each got their little bite of bread. And then he sings another zemer, and she comes out with a little pot, and she says, would you like some fish? He says, certainly. So she takes 2 beans out of the pot, and she puts them on his plate, and he eats them. Wonderful fish, and he sings a song. And then she comes out, and she says, soup? Yes, please. Another bean, right, is the soup. And they go through a whole 9-course meal, each of which is a couple of beans. And then at the end, they started singing and dancing around the table. Savanu v'oisarnu. Hashem, you've given us so much. We're satisfied, and we've even left over. Kidvar Hashem. At this point, the Hasidim lost it. And they started laughing. He said, it's too bad you laughed. He said, if you hadn't laughed, you would have been able to understand the secret of Shabbos. Meaning that it's the ability to connect through whatever food it is to that which is there, because the Nachla is unlimited. The tiny gateway can be there. The Kloisenberger Rebbe during the war was once being transported from one place to another on one of these horrible trains where they were all packed together. And there was someone he was friendly with who was not too far from him in the train, and he suddenly motioned to him like, do you have anything to eat? Now, this wasn't simple hunger. The Kloisenberger Rebbe actually did something that he didn't tell anyone else to do. He told everyone else to eat whatever nutrition you could, kosher, non-kosher, whatever it was, to stay alive. He himself had a siman min hashamayim that he would be able to survive the war without eating non-kosher. So he ate very little. But so it was surprising to this man that suddenly the Rebbe wants something to eat. So the man told me he had only one thing. He had a small raw potato. Something when they were getting marched through the empty potato fields, there would be some miserable little potato that the peasants didn't even bother to pick. At the risk of your life, if you picked it up, oftentimes they would shoot you. He had such a raw potato. So the Rebbe enthusiastically asked him for it, right? And the man gave it to him. He made, I believe the only bracha you could make is a shahakol on a raw potato. And he took a bite, and his face lit up, and he told the man, I'll never be able to thank you enough. And the man said, why? He said, that was Suda Shabbos. It's Shabbos today. I didn't have a Suda. That was the idea that he was able to experience that in that potato, in that which is there. Talmud Rebbe once said, he said, sometimes in your life, you're going to bump into a Shabbos where everything goes wrong. Right? It can be one of these things, the electricity went, so the food in the fridge spoiled, right? The plat is not on. All you have, is challah and hummus or something like that. That's what you got. He said, it's a tremendous opportunity that can be lost. If you say to your family, all right, it's going to be a bad Shabbos. It's not my fault. I don't run the electric company. Right? Sorry, eat your hummus and challah so you don't starve. It's not going to be a real Shabbos meal. It's not going to be that. That's a tremendous lost opportunity. If you can say, this is Shabbos, and now's our opportunity to see that it's not the food that makes the Shabbos. It's the Shabbos that makes the food. And if you're able to transmit that and to enjoy it and to do it, then you get a kinyan in Shabbos that stays with you, even in the most lavish Shabbos Sudas that are to come. So you have to extrapolate from this and think about it for all sorts of other physical interactions we have in the world that are all both spiritual and physical together, and to see what we're focusing on and to see what's the primary and what's the secondary. And that's why the mun was such an important part of the learning process. Chazal say, Lo nitna Torah ela ochlei hamon. The Torah was given to those who ate the mun. It wasn't just that the mun had this vitamin M or something that you needed, or vitamin T to be able to learn Torah. It educated you and cultivated the type of person who would then be able to appreciate the Torah. Okay, it's a good message for Tu B'Shvat also, when we will be appreciating the fruits and all these things. And for the rain that's coming down that we're about to walk into and get soaked, Baruch Hashem, right? You have to realize that rain is viewed as Hashem sending life into the world. Gadol Yom Geshamim, Chazal say, it's a day of tremendous simcha when Hashem sends the rain, especially here in Eretz Yisrael. So, wishing everybody all the bracha.